while folks are rolling in, we will get started. So let's kick things off. I am Gaby Goldstein. I'm co-founder here at Sister District, and I'm so excited to be in partnership with 17 national and grassroots organizations and groups tonight to have this fireside chat with journalist and author David Daley to talk about his new incredible page-turning book, Antidemocratic. I feel very cool because I have the uncorrected proofs for this book, and I'm not kidding. It really is a page turner. So, in terms of agenda, I'm going to share just a few quick words about Sister District and a few framing thoughts about the book, and then introduce Dave, and we'll dive in. So, a few housekeeping items. We have closed captioning. We'll put the instructions in the chat. We are recording this and we will host it on our website as well as send it around to folks who are in attendance. And we may have time for Q&A. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat. My apologies if things run long and we aren't able to get to all of your questions. And then finally, for folks just joining, please pop in where you're zooming in from. It's always great to see friends from coast to coast. So, as I mentioned, I'm co-founder at Sister District, where our mission is to build progressive power in state legislatures. My co-founders and I started this organization back in 2016 because we saw a gap in organizing capacity, in resources, going specifically to building power at this level of the government. And I always say, progressives, Democrats, we are tardy to the party when it comes to paying attention to states. Conservatives have been systematically building power at the state level, at all levels of government, but especially at the state level for the better part of the last century. And Dave's book is very much about that. But of course, these state legislatures are such an important venue of power. They have an outsized impact on every policy we care about, from abortion access to what our kids can and can't learn in schools. And as shines through in Dave's book, voting rights and election administration, these are often creatures of state law and are incredibly important. So as we head down the final stretch, we have 21 days until the election. This is the perfect time to gather together and learn about the right-wing long game, the right-wing attack on voting rights, democracy, and really commit to doing everything we can in the next 21 days to fight for our rights, to fight for our democracy. So I'm thrilled to be here with Dave Daley, who's the author of books including Rat Fucked, which helped spark the drive to reform gerrymandering, and Unrigged, as well as innumerable articles in outlets like The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and more. And so this book does two things at least. It thinks big and gives us, thinks big and small, giving us the long arc over the past 50 plus years, and then zooms in on some very recent important events, particularly Supreme Court cases, weaving the story together for us. And so some of the broad themes that we're going to talk about are, just as I said, the long game, right? I think that's the name of an early chapter in this book. This idea that the right has taken a long view, a steady effort to build power over a long period of time. And another theme that we're going to talk about is the importance of state legislatures. This really shines through in many of the episodes that Dave describes, where state legislatures have played a huge role in shaping the state of our democracy right now and in the future. But as I said, we've got 21 days to write the ending of the story for this year, and we have to make sure that this story's ending is part of a collective longer arc in our history of progress, and we all have the power on this call to do that in the next 21 days. So let's dive in. So let's talk about this long game. Let's talk about the 1970s. This is really where your story begins, Dave, and is really the dawn of the modern conservative plot to remake government. And as I mentioned, I'm here in Boston. I've been attending a convening at Harvard Law School about the regulatory state, and really working to make sure we have a game plan for what comes next, with some Supreme Court decisions that have really begun to continue to dismantle the regulatory state, get ready for Project 2025 and all the rest. And that story also traces back to the same two threads that you begin to unravel about the early 1970s in your book: the Powell memo and the birth of originalism. So tell us about the Powell memo and sort of where your story begins. The Powell memo, originalism, and why these are good places to really start the story of modern conservative efforts to shift power permanently to their side.
It's a great question, Gabby. Thank you. First, thank you, everybody at Sister District. Thank you for the work all of you have done day in, day out for the better part of a decade now. It matters. It matters so much. And one of the great things about doing these books is becoming friends and allies, and oftentimes co-writers with all of you there. It is a pleasure. So thank you for this, and thank you for joining me tonight with 21 days to go. Back to the 1970s. I think it's really interesting that you're at Harvard Law School right now, because I think so much of what we are talking about as we fight for a multiracial democracy in a nation that has not always lived up to that ideal, that we can trace the modern version of so much of this back to the backlash against the Warren Court in the 1960s that expanded rights, that suggested, I would argue, for perhaps the first time in our nation's history, that the Supreme Court could be a fountain of progress as opposed to a bastion of regression and racism. And liberals have almost seen the court frozen in time like that forever. It's almost like we see the West Wing. It is how the liberal legal movement views the Warren Court. They have a hard time believing that the Supreme Court could possibly be a force of backwards thinking in our society. To put this in a language that the old time goth kids like us will understand. It's like accepting that Morrissey is a racist and the Smiths. How soon is now? And so the right organized in reaction to the expansion of rights and really the breathing of life into the Reconstruction amendments that the Warren Court did over the better part of a decade, and that continued with the decision in Roe v. Wade after Warren had stepped down. There was a conservative lawyer from Virginia by the name of Lewis Powell, who was well acquainted with the Chamber of Commerce and all of the big donors on the right, Richard Mellon Scaife and the likes. He'd been in groups with them as far back as the 1960s. And Powell was very concerned about the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and campus and liberals in the media. And he wrote a memo for the Chamber of Commerce in the early 1970s that said, if we want to get involved in the fight, if we want to carve out a role for big business and conservatism in this country, the way to do so is to build conservative infrastructure, fight the battle of ideas, and the courts are the very best place that are oftentimes overlooked. And if we could build a beachhead in the courts, it would go a long, long way. Powell, all of us have written memos here, right? Powell's memo, in 3 months, Richard Nixon appoints him to the US Supreme Court. So that's a pretty effective memo, where he goes on to write some of the key decisions that provide the precedents for Citizen United 35 years later, some of the key voting rights cases that inspire a young John Roberts. But more immediately, what Lewis Powell does is he inspires and focuses the thinking on the right with billionaires like Scaife, the Koch brothers, Joseph Coors, the Bradley Foundation, the Olin Foundation, all of these big right-wing thinkers and donors, and they begin the process of building conservative architecture. This is where the Heritage Foundation is born. This is where Charles Koch begins his process and his journey. And it all starts with this memo that is definitely worth a read. I'm glad that Gaby dropped it in the chat. Yeah, deeply influential with all the right people. That old line about the Velvet Underground, right? Not many people listened to them, but everyone that did started a band. Not many people read the Powell memo at the time, but everyone who did started a right-wing think tank.
Yeah, and it was a clarion call to industry. So the other piece that I think is important in this is like the 1960s had been the sort of height of the rights revolution, right? The Warren Court, right? But the environmental movement, consumer advocacy movement, civil rights movement, we have all of these new regulations that come in to restrict industry, the polluters, the bad guys, right? Like, well, I should say the capitalists, right? And so part of Powell's point was we, the conservatives, need to fight in the marketplace for ideas. And we're losing the fight for hearts and minds in the public. And part of the reason why is because business is not playing in the political game. And so that, I think, really opened up the floodgates, opened the piggy bank, right? To conservative donors and others to institution build. And so, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but curious about that piece of it, the sort of the way in which industry answered that clarion call in terms of institution building, funding, media, the conservative legal movement, all of that, as a response to Powell's entreaty to spend money in politics.
It's exactly what happened. The right was getting killed. Big business was the enemy. It's amazing to look back at that time. One of the most popular posters being sold on campus was posters of the Bank of America in California being firebombed. The Bank of America on fire. This was up in dorm rooms. Ralph Nader and Unsafe at Any Speed. Ralph Nader, is hosting Saturday Night Live and on the cover of Time magazine, and the environmental movement taking off to such an extent that, like, Richard Nixon in his early State of the Union addresses has to say, we are all environmentalists now, the same way that Elena Kagan years later would say, we are all originalists now. The right and big business felt under siege, and Powell offered them a way out. Powell offered a roadmap, and not everything that Powell did. It's too easy to say that this is some magic bullet, but it suggested to them that there was a path back, and it suggested to them that they had to get in the fight. And they did in a big way, with all of the biggest donors on the right committing hundreds of millions of dollars to the cause, building things like the American Enterprise Institute, building the Heritage Foundation, building right-wing legal foundations across the country, investing in think tanks, in ideas. Nancy McLean's great book, Democracy in Chains, talks about the kind of investment that was done at George Mason University, and this had not been done before by the right to this level and with this degree of focus. And it proved deeply consequential.
Yeah, I love Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker did a really good deep dive into how industry answered that clarion call. And the DC business presence went from, there were about 100 lobbyists in DC in 1968 for business to over 500 just a decade later, right?
The
And so
Business Roundtable, K Street, they come in and run the show.
exactly, exactly. And so ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which everyone on this call should be well aware of.
All birthed in this moment.
That's right, all birthed in this moment of sort of the bottom of political power for industry. They saw it as an opportunity. Okay, we're at the bottom. F it, let's rebuild, let's try something new. And so in 1971, the Powell Memo, something else came out in 1971, a little article by Robert Bork, right? Tell us about that article, that law review article, the same year as the Powell Memo, and what that has meant for the next, however many decades it's been since then.
The Powell the Powell memo was not read by many, but everyone who did joined the cause. Robert Bork's article was probably read by even fewer, but all of them still very active in the conservative movement today. This is really the founding, in many ways, of the modern conservative legal movement. It's the birth of originalism. It's the birth of the idea that the justices on the Warren Court may have been expanding rights, but to conservatives, they were legislating from the bench. They were breaking with the words of the founders, with the words of the Constitution. And Bork begins to create and articulate an oppositional legal theory that over the years, and there are traces of originalism back in the 50s and 60s. You can trace some of this back to conservative opposition and states' rights arguments, post Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated schools. But really, it takes off with this Bork article that just becomes so influential among conservatives, among these new conservative public interest legal foundations, among young conservatives who perhaps look at a decision like Roe versus Wade and believe that it's wrongly decided, right? Wrongly decided because you cannot find the exact right to privacy words anywhere in the 14th Amendment. And it becomes this argument that judges are just making up the law because they're based on looking for specific outcomes. Whereas what you need to do is just follow the actual words of the law, which, as we all know now, 50 years into originalism, that originalism has become a Trojan horse. It's become a theory that allows the right to generate the outcomes that it wants based on oftentimes a twisted and incorrect sense of history, the interpretation of individual words, all of which, I'm talking to a lawyer who's been at Harvard Law School all day. So I am a journalist and not a lawyer, but this is the way that conservatives try to turn a jurisprudence of the right into common sense that Americans can get their heads around, and that can become a rallying cry on the right, and a secret code for lawyers who want to become judges to talk about in their confirmation hearings. that allowed them to avoid specific outcomes that they didn't want to talk about, but they were able to act as if they were serious and signal their political leanings by talking about originalism.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on it, it was a cooked up notion that I think that you have a line something like the grift became real, where we don't even know if any of these guys ever believed in originalism. It was a vehicle to deliver particular ends that they wanted to see, which were to espouse a revanchist worldview, right? Like to narrow protections from government in a time when the Warren Court had been expanding new rights. And so okay, so we have this huge influx of money into politics from conservative interests via the Powell memo, Clarion call to industry, all the things. We have the fodder for the grift of originalism being laundered through the legal academy, right? Law review articles, law professors, all the things. But then Powell gets on the court and it turns out things are too slow, right? Like institution building is a slog. Love that line,
As we
right?
know,
And
right?
right. And so then what? So you get on the bench, the change came slower than desired. So what did they need? What was the missing piece? And how did Michael J. Horowitz supply that missing piece for in the puzzle?
Change came far too slowly. And conservatives, in many ways, in the 1970s, drilled as many dry holes as they did oil gushers, right? The Heritage Foundation was a gusher. Some of their public interest legal foundations weren't. They generated, mountains of paperwork, but no actual advancement. And there was a man named Michael Horowitz, who had gone to Yale Law School, was very was active in the early civil rights movement, but he also comes back to New York and he's representing firefighters and sort of anti-affirmative action cases, and his politics start to change. And he has gone to Yale, so he is acquainted with all of these folks in the liberal public interest law firm movement. He knows Charles Halpern, who had run all of those big cases that banned DDT and a lot of the environmental things. He is, uh, a close with the Ralph Naders and the Gary Harts of the world. So he tries to understand why these organizations on the left, the ACLU, the NAACP, the Sierra Club, why are they being so successful? How are they getting all of these wins? And he goes to a conference that they host at Yale, and what he sees becomes the grist for his own memo. What he sees is sort of the liberal iron triangle of these interest groups and the lawyers and the federal agencies all sort of working together in order to create pro-environmental policies, pro-labor policies. And Horowitz says, well, this is the inside. This is how it's done. This is how you make change. You make change in Washington, not around the country where conservatives had built all of these organizations. And you make change by capturing agencies and by winning the hearts and minds of the young people who staff them and bring these cases. And he's like, we have not done that. He takes a look at the legal firepower on the right, and he says it is appallingly mediocre. And he says, what we need to do if we want to actually win a war of ideas and fight for hearts and minds is get into law schools. And we've got to start by inspiring and showing young people that there is a career path and a future in being conservatives. Michael Horowitz is brilliant at this. And when a handful of young legal students come to him with an idea to start an organization that they were going to call the Federalist Society. Michael Horowitz goes and connects them to all of these big donors that Lewis Powell helped inspire and get in the game. And they said, well, we aren't really running any plays in law schools. This would be really inexpensive. Why don't we try this, right? It's the best return on investment, perhaps, of any political movement of all time. The birth of the Federalist Society becomes the heart of the right-wing legal movement.
Yeah, and it's, I think, a theme throughout the book, but throughout this book and others, is the idea that a lot of the institution building on the right was an effort to copy the left. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, was meant to copy the success of labor organizing in the states. They thought the left really had it figured out at the state level, so they started ALEC. In the academy, there was a sense that liberals had captured the academy and they had to fight back and build their own institutions in the academy, and that included the Federalist Society. The thing that's so interesting to me is that was never really true. We never really had an organized effort in the academy to spread liberal ideas and bring them to law schools. I always say about my own law school experience that people with center-left sensibilities left law school radicalized. And people with center-left sensibilities, like myself, left with a romantic notion about judicial balance and fairness and justice, right?
You
And
left
so,
with the West Wing.
well, I actually never saw the
Yeah,
West Wing. I know that's
right. But
heretical for
like that
everyone.
idea, yes.
But exactly that idea. And so, the idea that there was a misperception on their side that we had it all figured out, actually allowed them to leapfrog over us, in the legal academy, in the states, and in other examples, where we're still behind. And so, anyways, I just think that that's a really interesting theme that comes out again and again, is the right's misperception that we'd really figured it out on the left, giving them the firepower, the fire under them to really get some institution building done on their side, then leaving us in the dust. So, but the Federalist Society, I mean, part of the brilliance of it is to focus on relationships, right? It's really I mean, we'll talk about this later, but it's really a resort. It's really a social club as much as it is a professional social club. And I think, the idea of building that one connection at a time was really powerful for them. So curious for your thoughts on that in terms of the Federalist Society's ability to, bring in disaffected or alienated young people and give them a place, give them a home, give them a family that then stays with them for the entirety of their career.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, um, to be a young conservative in the 1980s on campus, I do think was probably a lonely thing, right? I mean, anyone who's old enough to remember Michael Keaton I'm sorry, Alex Keaton, Michael J. Fox on Family Ties. He was not the most popular kid at school, right? He probably got his nose bloodied wearing a suit and tie to class and being a young Reaganite. So it was not cool, it was not trendy. And so providing a clubhouse that was safe for other like-minded people becomes, I think, really important. And the Federalist Society becomes a career path. It becomes a career ladder. And as people from the Federalist Society moved up into the Department of Justice, they began looking for other people who were from the same club as theirs. They weren't looking for fellow graduates of Yale or Harvard Law School. They were looking for fellow graduates of the Federalist Society because they knew that those were the true believers that could be trusted in these positions, right? And so the right's efforts to capture the courts were as slow in some ways as they were in the 1970s. They kept misfiring. I mean, if you look at the number of appointees to the court that conservatives have had compared to the number that liberals have had since the Nixon administration, the number is just outrageous. But conservatives kept misfiring. Gerald Ford, appoints John Paul Stevens, who becomes the long-serving liberal lion. Ronald Reagan appoints Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor, who were good on some things for conservatives, but not on everything. George H.W. Bush appoints Clarence Thomas on one hand, but also David Souter. George W. Bush appoints his old friend Harriet Mears to the seat that the Federalist Society effectively rises in outrage and says, we don't know who she is. She will not get this seat. And she backed down a month later, and Samuel Alito was nominated instead. And Leonard Leo told the New Yorker, I like that. I know Sam Alito. Leonard Leo comes into this story here, right? I mean, Leo is one of the early Federalist Society members. He gets out of school, and by the late 80s, he has joined the Lawyers Project, effectively, which means Leonard Leo's job, starting in the late 1980s, is to get to know every single conservative law student in the country and to know how his or her brain worked better than their mother knew. And as Leo has said over the years, this is not that hard if you just go out and do the work. And people knew that you had to have credibility within that group if you wanted to move forward, if you wanted to join one of these conservative law firms, if you wanted a shot at the bench. This was the way to do it. And they built a pipeline and an escalator and really an intellectual approval machine.
And also a network of real people who really knew each other and really cared about each other. I think that's sometimes missing from the story about the right's success, policy successes as well. People think of ALEC as a bill mill. I always say that that's a really cramped view of ALEC. ALEC is really a network of real people in relationship with each other who trust each other and introduce legislation that their friend, their colleagues have already introduced. And so that relationship piece of the Federalist Society is critical in understanding their success, because relationships are sticky. Everyone on this call knows that, right? We're all in community together. And that shorthand of knowing what we all stand for is extremely important. So Leonard Leo, love to talk about him. We're going to come back to that. But I want to take a quick jaunt through one of my very favorite stories in this book, which I didn't know anything about, and I've already been evangelizing today. This episode that you shared, which is, so okay, we've got the Federalist Society coming up through the ranks. We're like at 1980, early 80s. We have originalism, the raw materials of it laundering through our legal academy, legitimizing these ideas of originalism through the legal academy. And then we have, okay, but where does it all go? How do you actually make change? Where does it happen? Sure, the courts, but DOJ. So you have this fantastic story that you tell about the role of DOJ and under Meese in the early 80s in institutionalizing originalism and creating a think tank within DOJ, which is like a radical notion right now, right? But using DOJ to bring originalism into the mainstream, introducing terms we all, throw around now. That was all Meese. Curious to hear more about that. Tell us about Meese. Tell us about this radical notion of using DOJ as a think tank to bring in FedSoc, to bring in originalism, and all the rest.
This is what Meese wanted to do. Meese comes to Washington with Ronald Reagan, and he'd been by his side in California. And Meese shows up, and he's very lonely. he says, right? I think it's just as lonely to be the conservative attorney general as it was to be a conservative on a law school campus. Um, and he didn't feel like he had any allies to sort of get what they wanted to do done. They weren't able to appoint judges in a reliable fashion. They just didn't know what to do. And so you have an early melding of the DOJ and the Federalist Society, in which the DOJ and Edwin Meese, they hire all of these young people out of the Federalist Society into big jobs in the Reagan administration in the early days. So it becomes a signal, right? That if you want to be fast-tracked uh, to a powerful job in Washington, the Federalist Society offers that road. All of the Edwin Meese and all of the key folks at the Federal Society would show up at the Monday Chinese lunches in Washington, D.C., where they would all get together and they would talk about ideas. And they would then go back and they would operationalize these ideas in cases. I went back and found all the memos that Stephen Markman, who was the head of what they call the Office for Legal Policy, wrote back in the 80s. And he was writing memos to Charles Freed, who was the Solicitor General. And he was saying, I don't care if you lose this case, if you introduce this idea and this argument. We have a long term of trying to, our plan is to get these ideas into the mainstream. And Meese gives these big time speeches on originalism that the New York Times puts on the front page, and were very, very influential and serious. Some of the most important speeches maybe given by an attorney general ever, really introducing these ideas. And you had Bill Brennan, who was one of the big liberals on the Supreme Court, who engaged in the fight. And suddenly it becomes a back and forth, and it's a thing, and it elevates the idea of originalism. And it was all extraordinarily important in taking these concepts and turning them into a political movement. I mean, I talked to some of the people who were part of writing those speeches, and they were just like, we didn't believe this stuff. We had no idea this would actually become a thing. It just seemed like it was workable and that we could try it. So we did. And it clicked, right? And 50 years later, it's an originalist court, and as Justice Kagan says, we are all originalists now. But it started because conservatives had the wherewithal to turn the Department of Justice into a think tank.
I am obsessed with this. I don't care, quote, I don't care if we lose as long as we introduce these ideas, right? This is that, if anybody is a regulatory person on the line, you'll know that a recent Supreme Court decision, Loper Bright, overturns federal deference to executive agencies, administrative agencies, and we're in trouble. The regulatory state is in trouble. I love the idea of saying, I don't care if we lose, because on regulatory issues, we may lose, right? As long as we introduce these new ideas and take this 30, 40, 50-year view, long arc, to
And
get
this
where
is where these ideas that go into Loper Bright come from. This is where the unitary executive theory comes from. This is where so many of the things that have become mainstreamed and part of mainstream conservative legal thinking today, they begin in that intellectual think tank hothouse of DOJ.
Brilliant. And I mean, I love this. And Meese is the one. So, you mentioned, so part of this, his idea, part of the brilliance of this was to sell originalism to the public through speeches, through op-eds, go into tough turf. One of the biggest speeches that you talk about is that he gave this speech on originalism at the American Bar Association. And it was people were so outraged that Justice Brennan then went and did his own speech against originalism, which was the biggest possible win for the originalists, because then it was taken seriously. You get
Game on.
Justice Brennan to take you on, that legitimizes this crackpot idea. So it was such a smart thing for them to do, to play this long game and to use the legitimacy and power of the DOJ to seed these ideas and to launder these ideas into legitimacy and respectability by using the position of the DOJ and its actors. I'm obsessed.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yes, that
Obsessed.
is
Obsessed.
100% what they did.
Love it. I mean, I hate it, but like,
Yeah.
what
I mean, it's
chutzpah?
effective, right? We could learn something from what
Couldn't we?
they did.
Couldn't we, Dave? Yeah. So let's talk about Leonard Leo. So he really took
Yeah.
these raw materials and he
Hold
turned,
on. First, yeah,
I know,
if
seriously,
we're going to talk about Leonard.
Leonard Leo, he took these raw materials and he turned them into conservative legal gold, right? It was always going to be political. I don't know if it was Scalia or someone else who was basically like, look, it's not a serious jurisprudence. It's just better than what's out there. But they were able to sell it to the academic community, to the public. And then comes Leo, right? Like, tell us about Leo. Tell us his villain origin story and how he came to be the Supreme Court kingmaker.
He got to know every single conservative lawyer, and that makes you, it gives you the information that is necessary when conservatives have been stung by appointing Kennedy and Souter and Harriet Mears. Um, Leonard Leo, his nickname in high school is Moneybags. He has certainly become the conservative Moneybags. He now controls the Marble Freedom Trust, which is at least $1.6 billion in dark money, and all of those entities that are under the control of that octopus. But Leo is an intern on the Judiciary Committee in the early 80s, and Democrats are giving a hard time to a judge, and his job is to bring Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah a tuna sandwich. And Hatch is fuming in the back room about how Democrats treated this judge, who would resign years later in complete shame. Um, uh, and and Hatch was muttering about how he would make sure that Democrats were never able to do this again. But it was Leo who would actually take that lesson most to heart. And it started, as you said, with relationship building, getting to know every one of these people who were being appointed to positions beforehand so that there would be no surprises. No more suitors became the conservative rallying cry after George H.W. Bush squandered an appointment by appointing a squishy centrist. Leo became sort of the ideological knowledge and the ideological muscle to make sure that that wouldn't happen. He would go back and forth between the Federalist Society and running the confirmation hearings. He's at Clarence Thomas's side during that confirmation hearing. He is at John Roberts's side during that confirmation hearing. And as time goes on, and Leo's operation and the Federalist Society's operation are all sort of intermingled. The Federalist Society would say, well, we don't do any of that. We're just a debate club. But Leo would go to his office across the hall and run, a $10 million dark money operation to put Brett Kavanaugh on the court and to hold Merrick Garland at bay in the last year of the Obama administration, and to put Gorsuch on the court, and Amy Coney Barrett on the court. And they got to know all of these people, right? I mean, you go back and look at Amy Coney Barrett, and she was winning these SCAFE Foundation scholarships out of school, right? So every step of the way from Federalist Society to the court, the right person can just be groomed, almost cradle to grave, with this sort of right-wing grift. It is there and waiting, and you keep proving yourself. And then you go to Washington and you need a social circle, right? I mean, nobody wants to be left alone. If John Roberts were to go to a dinner party in Chevy Chase, he would feel hated, right? If he showed up, I mean, Brett Kavanaugh can't go to his country club and not feel uncomfortable. So this is why Leonard Leo sets them up with Paul Singer and Harlan Crow and all of these billionaires. This is why when that story came out a few years ago about Reverend Schneck, who was hosting dinner parties with all of these justices and putting them around like-minded people who would flatter them and tell them how smart they were and how important the work they were doing was. This is all part of what Leo does. He's created an entire universe for these conservative justices.
Yeah, and it's not just on the confirmation, the judicial confirmation network has I think, you put it so well in the book that they ran and they run judicial confirmations like political campaigns, right? And that's exactly right. So they do focus groups, they do ads, they do polls. During the Gorsuch confirmation hearings, that you write about this, that he was asked, what about this millions and millions spent on your confirmation? He's like, I don't know anything about that. But so it's this wraparound service that Leo's network is providing, from truly, as you said, and we are Goths on this line, but cradle to grave, right? I mean, from law school all the way through, and it's not just federal courts, and it's not just Supreme Court. And I really
All
appreciate
the
the
way up and
fact,
down.
yeah, that you spend some time talking about state AG races, state courts, state Supreme Courts, and
Leo is running all of that. His organizations, because he knows all of these people, he is the one going to Florida to meet with Ron DeSantis to approve of the Florida Supreme Court justices. He is the person running the operations in Wisconsin that so many people on this call probably worked really hard to try to flip the court progressive. It was Leonard Leo's ads and candidates that we were up against.
yeah, and the other thing, you mentioned having to create a separate social milieu for these people because they would be reviled in DC. And I loved this term. I had never heard it until I read your book, the greenhouse effect. Tell us why the social milieu, separate social milieu, is needed in order to avoid the greenhouse effect.
It has nothing to do with climate change, which conservatives don't believe in, right? The greenhouse effect has to do with Linda Greenhouse, who was the longtime correspondent at the Supreme Court for the New York Times. And for years, sort of in a vacuum, Linda Greenhouse and the Times's blessing and sort of intellectual, a good housekeeping seal of approval was what mattered in Washington, D.C. to many of these folks, to David Souter, to Sandra Day O'Connor, to Anthony Kennedy. You wanted to be taken seriously by Linda Greenhouse. And the right wanted to supplant that. In Georgetown social circles, Greenhouse was the king of the court, the queen of the court. But if if you did not attend those gatherings, if you attended other gatherings, if you could be surrounded by like-minded people, you were not at danger of moving from the right to the center to try to get the approval of the New York Times and the New York Times editorial board. You would stay comfortably where you were and in the lane that you were chosen to stay in.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that so many judges who were appointed by conservatives drifted leftward. because of the DC, the normalizing environment of DC. And so that's fascinating, right? Like you have to, basically Leo is like quarantining
Yeah.
these people in DC, the Supreme Court justices and the conservative lawyers in DC. They're quarantined from the rest of the public so that they don't drift leftward into like understanding that women are humans and like people have rights and these sorts of things.
Oh my God, can't have that.
I mean, can you believe? So, I mean, it's just wild the lengths that this ecosystem that he has helped create has gone to create a totally separate bubble for these folks, to sequester them, to use a judicial term, from the vagaries of like life amongst us, out here on the mean streets. So, I mean, it's just wild. But we have 9 minutes left. I don't know how. Everyone forgive me. The rest of so much of this book is actually about the Supreme Court and important decisions, especially under the Roberts Court. And we haven't had a chance to talk about them. And so we have taken this walk down history's lane, which I have appreciated, and I hope others have too. But I do want to talk about the court for a second. And one place that I really want to talk about the court is around the independent state legislature theory. We don't call it a doctrine around here because that means something is real. This is a theory. Dave, you and I have been writing and thinking about this for years, right? We have trees have been felled in our thinking and writing about this. Get us a little bit up to speed about the independent state legislature theory. The reason why I think this is an important place for us for this conversation is because we are focused on state legislatures at Sister District, and everyone on this call understands how important they are. And the right has, we know, been masterful at leveraging state legislative power for their own political outcomes. And it's kind of come home to roost in this, again, cooked up theory. Tell us about it. Tell us about Moore v. Harper, and situate us back in that story.
Well, the right has captured the Supreme Court. They've got a 6-3 supermajority on the court. And they've captured state legislatures through redistricting and gerrymandering that the court then turns around and blesses. So what you see is this sort of double knot that gets tied into democracy from control of state legislatures and control of the courts. The court frees these legislatures to take extreme action. Legislatures take extreme action and the court says that's just fine. So what Leonard Leo has built and what conservative redistricting strategies have built, all deeply, deeply intertwined. And so what you then need are these theories that can be used to justify gathering all of the power that you possibly can under the control of the institutions that you have captured. And the independent state legislative theory is one of those theories. Effectively, it says that it argues that all control over all election procedures should be vested in the legislature. Not in the legislative process that includes a governor or a gubernatorial veto or a state constitution or a state Supreme Court. All of that is extraneous. All of the power for this rests in the legislature. And so really, this is a cockamamie way of the courts trying to award even more power to gerrymandered legislatures to have even more control over elections. In Moore v. Harper from a couple of years ago, the court was asked to take on a really extreme version of the independent state legislative theory, and they declined to go that far. It surprised some people, but the truth of the matter was that they didn't have to. in that case because they'd already gotten the outcome they'd wanted when conservatives captured the Supreme Court in North Carolina. Moore v. Harper sprung from a redistricting case. Um, it had to do with a challenge to the maps that had been overturned by a progressive court in North Carolina, the wild Republican gerrymanders of the previous decade. Instead, fair maps were introduced, not Democratic maps, but fair maps. Republicans sued, saying that all power was in the legislature, that the Supreme Court didn't have the right to touch their maps. And because conservatives had already won the court and had already flipped those maps back into the maps that will be used in 21 days, the case almost didn't matter as much. And so they could sort of punt it. But what this court did that they do so well, and if you go back and you look at all of their cases on democracy over the years, and I focus a lot on Shelby County versus Holder in this book. But if you go back and look at Citizens United and Shelby County and Common Cause versus Rucho, the gerrymandering case, there's always a first case that they plant the seeds of the next case. And they do so through language that invites the next challenge. And so if you look at Moore versus Harper, there is a main decision that Roberts writes, and then there is a concurrence by Kavanaugh. And it's the Kavanaugh concurrence, I would argue, that we have to be paying attention to, because that's the dangerous thing. Because what Kavanaugh says is, well, in this specific case, yes, but I do think that there are times when a state legislature might go too far, and we don't exactly know which times those are. So we should hold off and decide in the future. And I think the reason that is so profoundly terrifying, 21 days out from a presidential campaign, is the thought of what this court might do if they get one of these cases involving the independent state legislative theory after the election. And there's a million different scenarios that could involve this case coming to them then. And what we know about this court is that this is the seat of Republican political power. What we know about this court is that they are very willing to put their thumbs on the scale for Republican political power. And I think that they would have no problem at all creating the independent state legislative theory and turning it into some kind of doctrine. If, for example, Pennsylvania is the decisive state and the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court holds open the polls in Philadelphia for an extra 90 minutes because the lines are so long and they want to make sure everyone in line votes. So let's say Republicans sue over that and say the state legislature doesn't have that right because all power in election cases is vested in a legislature. If that case in a Pennsylvania that comes down to 5 or 10,000 votes goes before the court on December 4th, I would be terrified.
Yeah, just to put a fine point on it, there was a lot of center-left relief over Moore v. Harper. Anyone on the call may have just gotten the impression ISL is dead. Independent state legislature theory is dead. And what Dave is saying is that that's not true. And actually, earlier in his book, he describes a number of other instances in which the Roberts court has done this kind of two-step feint to the right and then delivering this blow later. And that may be what we're seeing in the ISL case, which, as he's saying, could come right back to the court in 21 days, right? 22 days. And so I want to leave everyone with that, just because I think this is a very underreported matter in the press and is a really, really important thread that Dave finishes this book with, which is the idea that this court still has a number of levers of power to tip this election, this presidential election, and that we should be prepared for that and not be shocked when that happens and comes down the pike. This is all a little bit dark. Dave, let us end with hope, resiliency, right? The end of this book is not written. We've got 21 days on a long enough timeline. We are bending towards justice, right? What can everyone do on the call? What's giving you hope? How can we all rally in this moment and show up?
The arc bends toward justice, right? But it only bends toward justice when we grab it and pull it towards justice, because there's other people on the other side who are trying to grab it and pull it in their direction. And this book shows how determined they are, how far ahead they think, how effective that planning has been. We need to do the same thing, and it is going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us who know and understand and believe that democracy is not a noun. Democracy is a verb, right? It's that we all have to go out and do this work every day. We've got 21 days left to do it. So let's get out and get it done. We know that the other side is doing this work. We have got to be doing the exact same thing. The challenges that we face in this moment, they are real and they are serious, and I'm not trying to sugarcoat any of them. I think Gaby and I have never done any of that. But the challenges that we face are nowhere near as serious and difficult as the challenges that the folks before us had to fight and win and did fight and win, right? We are not standing on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We are not fighting for a women's suffrage. We are not fighting the Civil War. We are not fighting Jim Crow. This is a very different moment. We are fighting what is at heart some of the same battles that have never really gone away. But we should be able to take sustenance from everything that was sacrificed by all of those in this fight before us, to take the inspiration that we need to head into these last 21 days and do battle, and know that it doesn't end at 21 days, that this was a 5-decade effort. And we've got to put our heads down every single day in the exact same way and build the infrastructure and take this fight. If we do so, we can build the kind of country we want to live in. We can make a multiracial nation, a multiracial democracy. The fight is ours. This is ours.
1,000,000%. And you wrote an entire book, Unrigged, on the power of organizing and the power that we have when we organize and we fight. We are going to drop in phone banking links. We've got 21 days. Let's leave it all on the line. We really do have, this book is not, the ending is being written right now. And everything we know is that it's going to come down to a handful of states, and it's going to come down to a handful of votes in a handful of states. And everything we do between now and 3 weeks from today is going to make the difference. And so every single vote is going to count, not just at the presidential level, but at the state legislative level, at the state Supreme Court level. This is where we begin to build. And so I invite everyone to join us for a phone bank. It's fun. You don't have to not campaign for Kamala Harris. Just do a little bit at the state level. A little bit goes a really long way. And what you've heard tonight is that we're up against it. We are up against a serious, long-term committed infrastructure. And what we've got on our side is people power. We've got the people, but we have to get organized and we have to turn out. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to David for writing this book, for spending some time with us tonight, sharing his wisdom, sharing your wisdom, and hope for the resiliency that we do have, and what we can do in the next 21 days. And it doesn't end in 21 days, but let's focus on the next 21 days. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.